Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our chats with Emily, as we're calling our readings through the poems of Emily Dickinson contained within the Johnson edition. This is poem number 59, A Little East of Jordan. Here, I find this one of the most amazing poems early on. Certainly scholars have considered this the most important early poem of the Johnson edition, no question. Emily as wrestler, both wrestler with, of course, God and religion and the Christianity of her day, and then obviously wrestler with her craft and poetics. We'll read this poem from both counts. Now, Emily was a huge lover of the biblical corpus, and she loved the story that in some way so well mirrors the story of the ancient Greek myth of Prometheus, who of course provides all kinds of scientific knowledge and fire. For that, Zeus is going to condemn him to be crucified on a rock. And what is it that Prometheus does? Well, he shouts the F word at God and says, I did it, I do it 1,000 times over, to be very Promethean, obviously rebellious, which is why Mary Shelley called her novel Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Emily, very influenced by the Promethean myth, but she loves the story of the contest between Jacob and Esau in the biblical corpus of Genesis. We'll have more to say of it in a moment. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've already been introduced to our comments that are introductory in nature, and then I'm hopeful that you've been following our preceding 58 readings, 58 poems. We just finished with poem 58, Delayed Till She Had Ceased. Now, standing behind this reading is what Emily knew from the King James Version of the Bible, the Genesis 32, 24 through 32 story. Jacob has deceived his brother, his father and his brother, to receive the birthright, and for this he has had to flee, and he knows that his brother is coming to attack with possibly 400 troops, and Jacob is freaking out. He has an evening, and the story is now going to pick up. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, Let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. And he said unto him, What is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince thou hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. And Jacob asked him and said, Tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, Wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name? And he answered him there, and he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And as he passed over Peniel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. Therefore the children of Israel eat not of the sinew which is upon the hollow of the thigh unto this day, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh in the sinew that shrank. Now, this story is fascinating. Of course, Jacob is worried about the meeting with his brother, right, and for good reason. Notice the name change here from Jacob, which means supplanter, to Israel, which means a prince with God, or he who wrestles with God. Much has, of course, been made of that. And as well, this is going to be a naming poem that we're going to be looking at, because this is a naming story. That is to say, the naming of the spot Peniel, that is to say, to see God. Now, the great biographer Sewell will point out what I think is powerful. He says it this way, quote, The biblical characters, especially the Old Testament ones, lived for Emily as vitally and often as secularly as out of any of Shakespeare or her favorite novelist Dickens. About something disturbing her, she wrote Mrs. Holland around 1881, quote, Jacob versus Esau was a trifle in litigation compared to the skirmish in my mind, end quote. And we're going to see that she's very comfortable, assuming that you are comfortable with a story such as this. In other words, the naming of the activity, right, is going to be central here. Of course, to begin, a little east of Jordan will take us to the Genesis 3:23-24 passage of East of Eden, no question. So she's playing around with all kinds of fun references here. A little east of Jordan, evangelists record, a gymnast and an angel did wrestle long and hard. Till morning touching mountain, and Jacob waxing strong, the angel begged permission to breakfast, to return. Not so, said cunning Jacob. I will not let thee go, except thou bless me, stranger. The which acceded to. Light swung the silver fleeces, Peniel hills beyond, and the bewildered gymnast found he had worsted God. Now, I find this a powerful, powerful moment in the history of Emily's early poetics. She'll begin by using a tongue-in-cheek reference. And the tone here is significant. She takes a very important religious text, but she speaks of it with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek. Calling, for example, the gymnast, yes, and an angel. Jacob is the gymnast, right? Now, of course, a little east of Jordan, as we said already, immediately takes us to an earlier story, the casting out of Adam and Eve. Of course, these stories compound on each other, no question. A little east of Jordan immediately makes us think of Genesis 3:20, 3:24, and the east of Eden as Adam and Eve are being placed outside of the garden. In other words, think about the whole notion of wrestling with God. And the whole idea, much obviously has been made. Mythologists who love to study this, we think, of course, of thinkers even right now, currently, like Jordan Peterson, who love to make a whole lot of observations about this idea of wrestling with God. A little east of Jordan, notice its evangelists record. Well, of course, the recording is, evangelist is a Christian term, and obviously the story is pre-Christian, obviously. Evangelists record, obviously tipping of the hat to those evangelists that Emily grew up listening to, who are going to tell stories like this being one of the central ones. A gymnast and an angel. By the way, you'll remember the word gymnast when we met in poem 3, Sic Transit Gloria Mundi. You'll remember the earth upon an axis was once supposed to turn by way of a gymnastic in honor of the sun. This idea, of course, that she loves this idea of grappling, of exercise, energy. A gymnast and an angel, obviously Jacob and God, did wrestle long and hard. Now, we're going to come back to this idea of wrestling in poem 110 when we get there. It's gonna run like this. Artists wrestled here. Lo, the tent cashmere. Lo, a rose, student of the year. For the easel here, say repose. This idea of wrestling as being what artists do. I think it's important that we not forget that this is the way Emily saw her life. Her life as struggle. And wrestling is the great word here. A gymnast and an angel did wrestle long and hard. Of course, the long ago would be the long hard would be with fervor and all of that. Till morning touching mountain. Notice we'll have mountain and then we have hills, right? Till morning touching mountain, and Jacob waxing strong. The angel begged permission to breakfast. Now, of course, we read it. It's actually break. It's not breakfast. So again, I love the ironic tone that she's playing with here. To return. Not so, said cunning Jacob. Of course, the name Jacob means supplanter, and obviously he was cunning, and he had supplanted his older brother Esau, which is obviously a reformulation of the ancient story that predates this one of Cain and Abel, no doubt, right? Cunning Jacob, quote, I will not let thee go except thou bless me. And then the word stranger is after the dash, right? Now, I like the word stranger as it relates to the word bewildered. I like the idea that bless me is about acceptance. And you'll remember that we have mentioned already that one of the central poems of the corpus of Emily's work is poem 441 in the Johnson edition. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. The last lines of that is, judge tenderly of me. In other words, Emily was always about having her stuff accepted, or was she? That is to say, there's always this tension within Emily that if you don't get it, it's not my fault, it's your fault type of thing, reader. And certainly this was always kind of in the play of whether she would publish, whether she would not publish, and all of that. Except thou bless me. And then, of course, the word stranger. The which acceded to. In other words, okay, fine. Light swung the silver fleeces, penial, again, the word meaning here, the face of God, to see the face of God, hills beyond. But now how Emily finishes. Notice she never mentions the limb. That will be a part of Jacob's life for the rest of his life. And the bewildered gymnast found he had worsted God. Why is he bewildered? This is fascinating. In other words, is this a poem about discovery and self-discovery and artistic discovery, if we want to extrapolate to Emily? Or is it about doing something but then not being sure exactly what it is that you've done? She positions Jacob in that strange place where he's bewildered. He's not sure exactly what has happened, but he does know what? That he has worsted God. Now, of course, worsted is wonderful because that's very Promethean. It does play with the idea of worst as well, right? To overcome. And, are you ready for this? This is the only use in all of Emily's poetry of this word. And she uses it right here, right now. Well, what are we going to do at 2A with a set of lines like this? I think her argument is that all artists struggle, wrestling, right, with the muse. And at the same time, are never totally clear whether what they've done is legitimate or not. That is to say, they're bewildered. They're not totally ever clear about what it is to be a gymnast, to be an artist, to be a producer, to be a wrestler. Right? At 2B, I love the way that the rhymes are discordant. There is a certain dissonance to the rhymes. Do you hear them? Record, hard, or strong, return, or go to, or beyond God. It's as if the poem itself is wrestling with itself, and I love that. And as you can play this out, guys, and go and read it for yourself, and this is a poem that rewards a number of readings, to just hear those discordant rhythms and rhymes, and to know this is a poem about struggling in the same way, to 3A now, that, for example, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet will play that lovely blank verse of iambic pentameter until when? Well, when obviously there's friction. When, for example, Tybalt and Romeo are doing their thing and fighting, and obviously one dying, you'll have that beautiful rhythm. It'll be jacked up for some reason, right? And of course, I think beautiful artists understand how to use the language in this way. I'd like to take us at 3A, first of all, to Emily's poem at 201. And two swimmers wrestled on the spar until the morning sun, when one turned smiling to the land, "O God," the other one. The stray ships passing spied a face upon the waters born, with eyes in death, still begging raised, and hands beseeching thrown. Now, when we study 201, we'll come back to this idea that Emily loves the word picturing of wrestling. Go back to what we said in our talks with Walt when we did all the poems of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. He plays with a very similar kind of archetype. The idea that we're always engaged in struggling, hugging, back and forth. Here it's worsting, right? I like to think as well of Kafka's Metamorphosis, because I really like all of the different metamorphoses that happen in this poem. Notice, we'll go from gymnast to Jacob, to cunning Jacob, to bewildered gymnast, as we move through the naming that will become a part of this. And obviously we think about Odysseus and his naming of himself as nobody. We've already seen this, I'm nobody in Emily's poetry. Are you somebody by being nobody? I like to as well think of Shelley's 1820 offering of Prometheus Unbound. I think it's very possible that some of that stands behind this as well. Finally, at 3B, what's a time when you wrestled, if you will, with your own artistic talent? Maybe wrestling with deity, as Emily obviously did, in terms of making decisions about not being a part of the local congregation, and yet somehow being attached to the local congregation. Was a time when you wrestled with yourself and your own artistic capacities, and you were left in the end bewildered, if not bemused, kind of like reading a poem like this. Thank you, Emily, for bewildering us.